Who's ready to get started on their first loaf of sourdough sandwich bread? So here I have my saucepan that I will be adding the water to. So when I set the saucepan on my scale, I tare it back to 0. Then I will add my water. You can pre-measure your water, but I tend to just fill up a pot with our filtered water from our spigot, and then I just pour it in until I get close to my target number, which for this loaf is 388, and then I just kind of dollop it in. If you go over, you can just grab a spoon and pull a little bit back out, but like I said, you can always pre-measure and just dump it in. That might be simpler for some people depending on how your brain works. So next up, you're going to tare it again back to 0 now that you've added your water. So I'm going to add more water here, another 100 grams, because I use dehydrated milk in my sandwich loaf. But if you are using milk, you would add the full 118 grams of liquid milk. So it's just up to you how you like to do it. Dehydrated milk is really easy for me to keep in the pantry, and we don't typically drink a lot of milk at our house. Once I have my 100 grams in, I tare it again back to 0. You can see this is a recurring pattern. Then I'm going to add 18 grams of my dehydrated milk. This is a dehydrated whole milk. I recommend whole milk for this recipe. If you don't have dehydrated, just instead of doing 2 steps here, 1 step, 118 grams of milk. We're going to go ahead and tare it again back to 0. Now we'll add our organic olive oil. So just go slow and steady if you're adding it straight to your container, because it's really hard to undo if you add too much. And you can be off a gram or 2 and it won't impact your loaf. This is a really pretty beginner friendly sandwich loaf recipe, so your hydration can be a little bit off, your ingredients can be a little bit off, and it's pretty forgiving dough, but try and be as exact as possible. So after you tare the scale again, now you're going to add your honey. So the honey, like I said in my recipe, is optional, but I recommend starting out with the honey because it just adds extra fuel or food in your dough for the yeast. So again, it makes it more of a beginner friendly recipe when you're starting out with sourdough. Now, as you perfect this loaf and you want to do something different, you can remove the honey and you'll get more of a sour flavor to your dough. So let's go ahead and put the saucepan on the stove. I only put it on low because if you overheat it, then you'll be waiting for it to cool off. You cannot add your starter to your wet ingredients if they are too warm. They will kill off your starter and you will have to add commercial yeast to your dough in order to do anything with it. So don't overheat at this stage, and if you do, wait for it to cool back down. 95 degrees is just like an estimate. You just want it warm to the touch. So now that the ingredients are warm to the touch, I go ahead and put my stand mixer bowl on the scale and tare it. Then I add the wet ingredients to my mixing bowl. You want to get out as much as you can just because you weighed it so precisely. So use a spatula, get out your ingredients. So go ahead and tare your mixing bowl, and this is the step you'll add your starter. So you're going to add 148 grams of your starter. Your starter should be right between a double and a triple in size, so it's still it's growing. It's not past its peak. And go ahead and weigh this in as close to 148 as you can. You can see the texture here. It's really hard to describe, but it's not runny. It's very stiff. So it's rubbery almost. Kind of like slime, the slime you let your kids play with. So try and get as close to 148 as possible. If you're a little over or a little under, it won't affect your end result too much, just because this is a very forgiving recipe. Like I said before, it's a great beginner recipe for sourdough. And you'll see that there's enough left over in the jar for your starter, for your next batch of starter. You have to think of starter as an inoculant. So what you are doing right now is you are adding in the yeast to inoculate your dough. So if you add more starter at this stage, your dough will ferment faster in the bulk ferment stage. If you add less starter, it will take longer to bulk ferment. So people can play around if they're more advanced sourdough bread makers with the amount of starter they use in their doughs, depending on their timelines they're looking at. But I recommend just sticking with the recipe for now and just understanding the concept behind how much starter or how little starter different recipes use. You can see what I'm doing here is breaking up the starter. So you don't want a big clump in with your wet ingredients. You want it dispersed into smaller clumps. Now you can go ahead and put your mixing bowl on your stand mixer. If you don't have a mixer, you can knead by hand. I add a little bit of the flour, start it mixing, then I slowly add more and more of the flour. You'll notice I have not added any salt to my dough yet. Do not add salt until you're done with this stage. I'm going to let the dough hydrate. So once I have all the flour in there, I will set this aside for 30 minutes and let that flour fully hydrate with the water and the wet ingredients before I add the salt. So much of sourdough is by sight. So just keep that in mind that you need to do the ingredients very precisely, but the dough itself a lot of it is by sight. And if you have different flour than what I'm using, your dough may end up drier or wetter than mine. So definitely keep watching and kind of get a feel for what my dough looks like in case you need to make adjustments. But a lower hydration or a higher hydration dough will still work with this recipe. So you can see it's pretty shaggy at this stage, but all my flour's in, and I'm going to go ahead and scrape the bowl down to make sure all that flour is going to be in that dough ball so it can all hydrate together for the 30 minutes. So take your time and make sure it's all scraped down, blend it up. It's going to, like I said, look really shaggy at this stage, and that's perfectly fine. We are just hydrating the flour at this step. Now it's time to cover up your bowl. You always want to cover your dough so it doesn't form a crust, and set it aside for 30 minutes. Now we're back. It's been resting for 30 minutes and hydrating. Now I'm going to slowly add my salt. You can see the salt changes the texture a lot, and even the dough ball itself texture has changed after hydrating for 30 minutes. Don't rush into getting your salt into your bowl. Just take your time. Let your mixer do the work for you. So I don't rush this stage, but the salt is the very last ingredient to go into your dough. Don't forget it, otherwise your dough won't form. So if you are concerned that you might forget it, weigh it out when you do your other ingredients and have it sitting there on your counter. So later if you see it, you think, oh my goodness, I forgot to add the salt, and you can add it. So you can see it's forming a nice ball. The bowl edges come clean. The sides of the bowl are nice and clean. It's a pretty thick dough, so a pretty stiff dough, but you can see my mixer can get that thing around. It's moving it pretty good. So this is a 10-minute process. Don't rush it. This is a lot of where you're developing the gluten. So let your stand mixer do the work for you. Mine can only really handle the dough on low, otherwise it will walk itself off the counter. So I just do 10 minutes on low. Keep cleaning the dough hook. Yep, and so this is pretty much at the end of the 10 minutes now. It creates a pretty tight little dough ball. If you wet your hands, it keeps the dough from sticking to your hands. The dough should be pretty sticky, but this isn't a really high hydration dough, so it should still be pretty easy to work with without having to keep wetting your hands. I use a dough scraper. So here my hands, I've wet them again, and I'm going to put them into this casserole dish. I like using glass so I can see the dough develop and the bubbles on the bottom. I forgot to oil my casserole dish before I put the dough in, but I usually drizzle a little bit of olive oil in the dish, spread it around with my hands, and then grab the dough out. That way it just doesn't stick as much, but it's fine if you forget that step. You can also use water in your casserole dish to keep the dough from sticking. Just as a reminder, we are entering the stage of sourdough creation that is the very visual stage. So we are attempting to bulk ferment this dough that we've just created until it is increasing size by 50% to 100%. Now, it's kind of a range just because it is pretty flexible, but just know what your goal at this stage is. Your goal at this stage is to let that yeast inoculate all of your dough so that your final proofing goes smoothly in the oven. So you don't want to rush the bulk ferment. You can see I'm checking the bottom of the casserole dish. This is about an hour later after I first put it in the dish. Not a whole lot of bubbles yet. I do these stretch and folds just to get a feel for what my dough texture is like. These are optional stretch and folds, but I recommend it if you're a beginner, just to get a feel for your dough. It can be kind of therapeutic doing the stretch and folds. So what you're looking for is the dough to become kind of jiggly in nature. So that's how you know that there's enough air in the dough, that the yeast has reproduced enough that your final proof in the oven will go well, and ultimately your oven spring when you go to bake. So don't rush this stage. I put mine in the oven with the light on just to kind of speed up the process a little bit. I regretted that decision later because I went skiing with Sam and forgot about it. So what I ended up coming back to for the third stretch and fold, I haven't gone skiing yet. This is my next stretch and fold when I haven't forgotten about it yet. And you can kind of see the bubbles are forming along the bottom. It's increased in size. It's looking good. We're not quite to where you want it before you cold proof it. So keep letting it grow past this stage. Like I said, the main point of this, it's like doing a yeast bread where you let it rise, then you punch it down, and then you do your final shape and proof in the oven before baking. So you can see it's getting a little bit of jiggle to it. So we're getting closer, but you want to keep letting it grow after this stage. These stretch and folds also encourage gluten development, which allows your bread to have more oven spring, which is that rise that you see once you start baking it. So the stretch and folds are great for getting a feel for your dough texture and for developing gluten. But most of your gluten development with this one is done in the stand mixer. If you just want to leave it, that's totally fine. I learned a lot by doing the stretch and folds. That was the second stretch and fold, so we're about 2 to 3 hours into the bulk ferment stage. Now you can see where I forgot. I went skiing, I came back, and it was huge. See all the bubbles, so it is alive and well. This is what it looks like if you maybe left your dough too long in the bulk ferment stage, but it isn't going to go limp on me yet, so it'll be fine. It helps a ton that there was honey in this dough, so there's plenty of food for my dough. You can see how big and jiggly it is now, so we are good to go. This is a little bit over bulk fermented than what I shoot for, but it's close enough. It'll be fine. This recipe, like I said, is very forgiving, very beginner friendly. You can see the jiggle, so we are good to go. Now put it in the fridge and let it cold proof. Now my dough has been in the fridge overnight. This is about 6 o'clock in the morning. I am up. I like to get it proofing because it takes a couple hours for it to oven proof, and then you want to leave enough time to bake it. So the ski hill opens at 10:30, so I like to get this process started nice and early so the bread is baked and I can go ski with my youngest if he wants to. I oil the counter first so it doesn't stick. And then you can see I already greased my cast iron loaf pans. I just used butter in those. I tried olive oil in the cast iron loaf pans and I find that butter just works better. So you can see here my loaf has risen has continued to rise in the fridge. So it's pretty big. I think it will still all work out. Like I said, this recipe is very flexible. So you're going to half your dough. I didn't know where my dough knife was, so I just kind of grabbed it and split it with my hands, pinched it off. The dough is pretty stiff coming out of the fridge, so it takes just a minute to work it out. So be patient with it. If you need to let it warm up a smidge before you roll it out, don't hesitate to let it warm up. I use my palms primarily to get this half of the dough into a rectangle. Once you become more familiar with this recipe, you can always opt to skip the overnight cold proof and do a same day loaf if you want. Just be aware that the overnight cold proof is what gives it that more sour flavor of the sourdough, that traditional sourdough flavor. So if you omit the honey, it will gain more of that sour flavor profile to it. But the overnight cold proof is a critical component if you want that more sour flavor. So just keep that in mind. You can cold proof or not. It's up to you. This process works out well for me because I can just bake first thing in the morning, and we all love that sour flavor of the sourdough bread. So you can see here I'm making a rough rectangle. The short width of my rectangle is the long width or the length of my loaf pan. So I'll just start rolling it away from myself and towards the loaf pan. I flip my dough here because I find when I do that, my exterior crust looks nicer, just because there's less folds and creases when I flip my dough. I don't know why that is. So you can see here I'm tucking the ends in as I roll just to create nice surface tension. I give a little bit of a pull to it as I roll again to create more surface tension. So there's no big trick to this. Just roll it up. I pinch the ends, tuck them under, and just take your time. Make sure your loaf is nice looking, because this is pretty much going to be what your finished product is. So sometimes I have more dough on one end of my log roll than the other, so I try and even it out with my hands, because if you have more dough on one end, one of your loaf ends will end up rising bigger in the oven. So plop it in, do the second one the same way. Now it's time to put it in the oven at 85 degrees to let it oven proof. This process is again by sight, so my timeline might be different than your timeline, so just keep an eye on it. Do not overproof these or they will fall, and then you'll end up with flat loaves of bread. So just keep an eye on them. 85 degrees. I'm starting out at an hour and a half, and I'll check it after that to see how well they're doing. This is an hour and a half later. It's looking good. It's starting to grow again. This process, again, can change based off of how long you bulk fermented, how much yeast is in your bread. This is a half an hour after that, so 2 hours in, it's looking pretty good. Keep a pretty close eye on it once it starts to fill out the pan. This is 15 minutes later, and it's pretty much ready to go. It's about 1 inch above the lip of the loaf pan. You can do a poke test if you want, but I have done this enough times. I can tell these guys are about ready. They'll continue to rise in the oven, so you don't want them all the way fluffed up yet. I'm measuring with my finger. About 1 inch is what we're looking at here above the rim, just to give you guys a nice visual of what that looks like, just to my first knuckle. So you can just kind of eyeball it from there, and you want that nice filled out look in the loaf pan. If you don't bulk ferment long enough, this stage will go slow and you'll get more air bubbles. You can see I have an air bubble along the side that I'm going to pop. So don't skimp on the bulk ferment stage. That way your oven proof goes swiftly. You don't want to extend too much longer than 2.5 hours, or you'll start to get big air bubbles in your sandwich loaf. Now it's time to remove the damp tea towels, and you're going to start baking from a cold oven to 350 for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, I rotated the loaf pans in the oven and let it go another 10 minutes. Every oven will be a little bit different, so just keep an eye on how brown your crust looks. These are the loaves coming out. Now I got a little bit more rise in the oven. They call that oven spring, but I didn't get a ton more like normal. So I think if looking back at my process, remember how I said in the bulk ferment stage that it was quite a bit bigger than I normally let it go. So I think it used up a lot of its fuel and resources in that stage, and there wasn't as much left at this final stage to give it more rise. So just keep in mind and kind of tweak your process. But like I said, these will turn out into be great loaves. So it is pretty flexible. You can over bulk ferment, and you can still get great loaves. So I would say my bulk ferment was more than double. So I would shoot for more like a increase in size of 50% to 100%, which would be a half to double in size. After 5 to 10 minutes, you're going to go ahead and pop your loaves out and let them finish cooling on a rack. Your loaves should pop out, and this is where if they don't pop right out, you might want to change how you're oiling your cast iron loaf pans. When I use butter, they just roll right out. If I use olive oil, they stick, and I have to use a butter knife to help them clear from the sides so they will pop out and onto my wire cooling rack. So, and just let them cool long enough that they are ready to slice. These loaves don't require a long cool time before you can cut into them. So flashing back to the bulk ferment stage, you can see here that my dough has definitely more than doubled. So that's why if you use up all of its food in this stage, in the bulk ferment stage, there won't be enough left over when you go to oven proof and bake to get a nice rise out of your loaf. So you can kind of play around with the variables. There's not a whole lot to sourdough when you actually boil it all down. It's just getting that yeast to reproduce enough that you can make a nice loaf out of it, but not so much that it uses up all of its resources before you bake it. Again, this is why this loaf is so beginner friendly. I walked away from the bread while I was on the cooling rack for 5 minutes. I came back and the kids had already thrown it on the cutting board and eaten half the loaf. So they don't care about much. This bread always turns out delicious and it always gets devoured. So don't overthink it. Just kind of follow the steps. And if you didn't get exactly the results you were looking for, send me a message. I'm happy to answer questions or help you troubleshoot. But this is very beginner friendly, so just go for it and enjoy the process. Get to know your dough. Go into this recipe knowing it might take a couple tries to get a good loaf, but that you can do it. So go forth and bake.